Hello everybody. I am going to be doing some video lectures for chapter 14, which covers the Bustle period and the gay 90s. So 1870 to 1900. And we're going to be breaking these up into different sections. Bustle period is generally considered 1870s and 1880s. And of course, the gay 90s is the 1890s. So what I'd like to do first is to do a video about some background information that will help you to better understand this time period. So, the bustle period, first of all, is named for the underproper called a bustle that concentrated the fullness on a woman's silhouette towards the back of the body. And that will change in several different ways, which we'll see as we get into specifics. The gay 90s is the name given to the last decade of the 19th century in the United States, but in France they called that very same decade La Belle Époque, or the beautiful century. So let's just, first of all, hear some things that happened and what was going on in the world at this time period, because as we get further and further into history, into time, technology and everything else is advancing at a much, much faster pace, so a lot more fashion choices are going to be available to everybody, from lower class to upper class. So first off, here's just a bunch of dates of things that you might find interesting, of things that occurred during this 30 years. In 1874, we start having the Impressionist paintings appear. Their first showing was in 1874, and this was pretty much a reaction against more traditional and conservative art forms. Kind of raised a stir. 1876 is the very first telephone. 1879, we have the first electric lighting available, although gas lighting is going to stay around for quite a while, but electric lighting starts being available in the 1879 and on era. The 1870s through the 90s is also another kind of, well, I guess you could call this a style tribe, really. A group of people that started a clothing movement that's referred to as the aesthetic movement. And it's related to the aesthetic movement in the arts. And I'll talk more about that when we get into specifics. In 1885, we had the first horseless carriage tested, the first car. In 1887, the first Sears Roebuck catalog came out, which really changed American life, because now everybody had access to a huge department store worth of goods, which included clothing and outerwear and even hair goods. 1877, the phonograph was invented. 1890s, we're starting the Art Nouveau movement. 1897 was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. 1892, Vogue magazine was first published. And 1893, something that's very, very important to us. Well, two things, really. First of all, Freud published his first treatise on psychoanalysis, but the bigger thing for us is, I believe, the first patent for a zipper was registered. It wasn't perfected until later in the 1900s, early 1900s, but they first started experimenting with that in the late 1890s. So, here's a little bit of historical background from 1870 to 1890. So, bustle period background, a little bit by country here, to just get you a frame of reference for what is happening in the world. Okay, in Britain, we are still under Queen Victoria's empire, and it grows even bigger during this time period to include lands all over the globe. In the 1870s, there's a great economic boom, and all kinds of things start to happen. There is also some social social reform movement started in Great Britain, some passage of legislation to clean up the slums, to improve sanitary conditions. But there were no major big problems in Britain at this time period, no wars for England. In France, we've got the Franco-Prussian War from 1870-71, and it leads to Napoleon III surrendering to the Prussians and then abdicating the throne, and this second empire of France is over. In 1872, there's even a civil war in France called the Commune. There's a struggle of Paris radicals against conservative France. So there's more unrest in France, where the head of fashion is located in Paris, than there is in Britain. In the United States, well, of course, 1870, the Civil War has been over for 5 years, but of course the effects of the war are still very, very prevalent. But several advancements are really important. The railroads now are connecting the east and west coasts. And as we started to see in the Romantic area, the settlers are moving west in large numbers, looking to settle lands. And the gold rush is pretty much over by this time period, although there's still people hanging around. But lots of people are going west to claim land and to start a new life. There's also a real movement towards industrialization in the United States as well as in other countries. But it leads to the creation of lots of cities and lots of people leaving farming to go to the cities and get a factory job. Lots of immigrants coming to the United States looking for that American dream and hoping to find work in factories. However, what happens is that leads to overcrowding in the lower class areas of cities and creation of slums, a lot of labor strife and poverty and exploitation of workers that will ultimately result in riots and eventually unionization of a lot of occupations. However, a lot of immigrants came over to the United States during this bustle period and were successful. It wasn't an easy life, but many, many did it. From crowded tenements to suburban Victorian-style mansion to farms on the prairie, life, however, was really family-oriented during this time period. And, of course, the family had to have a head of the family, which was the man or the father or the husband. So this was a very patriarchal society, with the man being the head of the household. When we talk about historical background in the gay 90s, so 1890 through 1900, a few things of note. In the United States, the cities are still growing and more towns and cities being populated in what we consider the West and the West Coast areas. In England, by the time we get to the 1890s, poor old Queen Victoria is considered now pretty old-fashioned by the rest of Europe and the United States. Her son and heir, the Prince of Wales, is very popular. He was kind of a very dashing social figure, and he was a ladies' man and had many mistresses, even though he was married with a family. And he lived a life that his mother very much disapproved of, because she was very, very strict. One of his mistresses was the actress Lily Langtry, and there was a wonderful BBC series about her years ago. Anyway, he was very much a party boy, and he loved to go to the opera and to the theater and to the symphony, but he also had a tendency to go to dance halls and some other places, classy brothel-type places. He was a gambler and he drank a lot, but he ends up being king in not too long a time period. But he was very much a controversial figure, and there are several fashion things that are related to him. Paris is still considered the pleasure capital of Europe, and a couple new things that happen. The Dance halls of Paris become popular during this time period. The Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergères, which were risque song and dance halls, and sometimes even topless. A little bit of striptease going on, but those were like a very trendy, cool thing, edgy thing to do. There were a lot of houses of prostitution in this time period in France. They referred to this, I said, as La Belle Époque. This was kind of a decade known for fun and carrying on. Kind of a rebellion against the real conservative, strict, moralistic, Christian way of life that had been so prevalent under Queen Victoria, and it was now going to come to an end pretty soon. We still have the fashion houses of Charles Frederick Worth, but also Paquin, Paquin. You may have heard of him. He gets started in the 1890s. Lots of outdoor cafes in the city of Paris and theater, and the impressionistic artists are now going to be the leaders of the art world instead of being the rebels doing this shocking new style. That's trendy, and that's definitely in. There's also, you could probably say, a little bit of a revival of historic styles during this 30 years of 1870 to 1900. In addition to a lot of new architectural and furniture and interior decoration stealing from the past here and there, looking back into history and finding features that they wanted to use and tweak. Fashion is also going to take inspiration from historic styles. There's a few things that you might notice, such as there are hanging sleeves that kind of are reminiscent of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance on some of these ladies' garments, both indoor garments and especially outdoor garments. There's something referred to as a Medici-style collar that was reminiscent of the 16th and 17th centuries that comes back into some of these ladies' clothes. Skirts that look like the 18th century polonaise with the overskirt that could be pulled up into several different puffs. And the idea of shoes that had what was called the Louis heel, like Louis XIV or Louis XVI heels with a little bit of curve. Those come in on ladies' shoes and boots. In 1890, the Impressionist art of the 1890s is not really going to have a lot of influence on costume for men or women, but the new style that starts to come in the 1890s, the Art Nouveau style, definitely will have an influence. So that's a little bit of history and background and context for you. In the next video, I'll get started talking about women's clothing in the Bustle period.